Hit subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and stay until the end, because tonight, we're stepping inside Virginia's oldest prison cells, where time didn't just stop, it hardened. The sirens cut through the humid Virginia night like a blade. Blue lights bounced off the brick row houses of Richmond's south side as patrol cars skidded to a halt. A crowd had gathered behind the yellow tape, silent, watching officers disappear into a narrow alley that smelled of stale beer and hot asphalt. At the center of it all lay a body. Detective Marcus Hale stood over the victim, hands on his hips, jaw tight. The man on the ground was elderly, white hair matted with blood, thin frame swallowed by an oversized flannel shirt. 92 years old. His name was Tommy Reddick, and he had been out of prison for only 8 months. The murmurs started immediately. Why was a man that old walking alone at midnight? Who would want him dead? And why, after spending nearly 6 decades locked inside Virginia's most unforgiving correctional facilities, would freedom end like this? Hale didn't answer the press. He stared at the victim's hands instead. Scarred knuckles. Faded ink across his forearm, numbers barely visible. A prison ID from 1965. Tommy Reddick had been one of the 10 longest-serving inmates in Virginia history. And now he was dead. But this wasn't just the story of one man. It was the story of 10. 10 prisoners who had entered the system when segregation still gripped the South. 10 men who had watched presidents rise and fall through a 6-inch slit of reinforced glass. 10 inmates who grew old inside concrete walls while the world outside digitized, globalized, transformed. Some were over 90 years old. And one of them had just been murdered. Greensville Correctional Center sits in southeastern Virginia, surrounded by miles of flat farmland and thick pine forest. From above, it looks like an industrial complex, orderly, contained, forgettable. But inside, time stretches differently. Warden Elise Carrington had worked there for 23 years. She knew every corridor, every echo in the steel stairwells. She also knew the old tier. That's what correctional officers called the unit that housed Virginia's longest-serving inmates. Not officially, of course. On paper, it was simply G Block. But G Block was different. The men there walked slower, spoke softer. Their crimes dated back to another era: armed robberies in the 1960s, murders from the 1970s, kidnappings that had once dominated black and white headlines. Among them, Samuel "Red" Whitaker, incarcerated since 1964 for a triple homicide during a botched convenience store robbery. Leonard Bishop, convicted in 1968 for the abduction and murder of a young couple along the Blue Ridge Parkway. Calvin Morrow, sentenced in 1972 after a prison riot left 2 guards dead. Harold Finch, who had been denied parole 11 times. And Tommy Reddick, who had walked out in 2024 after 59 years behind bars. Most Americans never think about inmates aging in prison. They imagine bars filled with young men, volatile and dangerous. But in Virginia, a quiet reality had taken hold. Men who had entered at 20 were now pushing 90. Healthcare costs soared. Wheelchairs replaced handcuffs. Some required oxygen tanks during roll call. But their pasts did not fade with wrinkles. Detective Hale requested full files on all 9 remaining old-tier inmates within hours of Reddick's death. At first glance, it seemed absurd. These men were elderly, frail. But Hale had learned something early in his career: violence doesn't retire. Inside the evidence bag taken from Reddick's apartment, officers found a letter. Handwritten. No return address. You should have kept quiet. Some things were buried for a reason. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, but deliberate. Buried. Hale flipped through Reddick's parole records. There it was, an addendum filed just 2 months before his release. A sealed testimony given to the Virginia Parole Board. The contents were classified. Why would a 92-year-old man provide secret testimony before walking free? And who was he talking about? Warden Carrington didn't hesitate when Hale requested a visit. "You think one of my old men ordered a hit?" she asked, her voice steady but eyes guarded. "I think someone was afraid of what Reddick said," Hale replied. Inside G Block, the air felt heavier. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The scent of antiseptic mixed with something older, like paper left too long in a damp basement. Samuel Whitaker sat in a wheelchair near the common area window. His skin was thin as tissue paper, liver-spotted hands folded neatly in his lap. "You hear about Tommy?" Whitaker asked before Hale even introduced himself. "You heard?" "News travels," Whitaker said softly. "Even in here." Hale studied his face. No visible emotion. Just patience. "Did Reddick have enemies?" Whitaker gave a faint, dry laugh. "Son, we all had enemies. That's why we're here." Across the room, Leonard Bishop stared at the television but wasn't watching it. His hearing aid whistled faintly. "Tommy talked too much near the end," Bishop muttered. Hale turned. "About what?" Bishop's eyes shifted toward the correctional officer's station by the door. "About the riot," he whispered. The riot. Calvin Morrow's file resurfaced in Hale's mind. 1972, Mecklenburg Correctional Center. Official report, inmate uprising over living conditions. 2 guards killed during the chaos. Several inmates injured. Case closed. But Hale had investigated enough cold cases to know that prison riots are rarely spontaneous. "What about it?" Hale pressed. Bishop's jaw tightened. "Ask Morrow." Calvin Morrow was 91 and bedridden. Tubes snaked from his arms. His breathing was shallow but steady. When Hale mentioned Reddick's name, Morrow's eyes fluttered open. "He shouldn't have talked," Morrow whispered. "Talked about what?" Morrow's gaze locked onto Hale's with surprising intensity. The guards weren't the only ones who died that night. The room felt smaller. "What do you mean?" Morrow swallowed hard. "There was another body." No record mentioned a third death. Hale requested archived documents from 1972. Most were digitized. Some were not. He drove 3 hours to a storage facility outside Richmond where boxes of old prison records gathered dust. Inside one mislabeled file, Maintenance Reports, Q3 1972, Hale found a folded incident memo. Never filed officially. Never entered into court proceedings. It described an inmate named Victor Salas. Age 23. Transferred to Mecklenburg weeks before the riot. Reported missing during the chaos. Presumed escaped. But there was no escape report filed with state police. No manhunt records. No witness statements. Victor Salas had vanished inside a locked prison. And according to the memo, the last inmates seen near Salas were Reddick, Whitaker, Bishop, and Morrow. 4 of Virginia's longest-serving prisoners. Hale stared at the faded signatures at the bottom of the page. 2 correctional officers, both long deceased. If Salas didn't escape, where was he? Back in Greensville, Hale requested permission to inspect the old architectural blueprints of Mecklenburg Correctional Center. The facility had been demolished in the 1990s, replaced with modern infrastructure. But demolition doesn't always mean excavation. Sometimes foundations are simply sealed. He found it in the subbasement schematics. A maintenance tunnel beneath cell block C, narrow. Unmonitored during the riot due to smoke damage. A space large enough to hide something. Or someone. Hale returned to G Block with a photograph of Victor Salas, young, dark-haired, eyes sharp with defiance. He placed it in front of Whitaker. For the first time, the old man's composure cracked. "That's not possible," Whitaker breathed. "You remember him," Hale said. Whitaker's fingers trembled. "He was supposed to be gone." "Gone where?" Whitaker looked toward the corridor, as if the walls themselves might hear. "We buried him," he whispered. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Buried. Not outside. Inside. And if Hale was right, the truth Tommy Reddick had taken to the parole board wasn't just about surviving prison for 60 years. It was about a murder no one ever recorded. A murder committed by men who had grown old pretending it never happened. But when investigators pulled the old demolition records of Mecklenburg Correctional Center, they discovered something that changed everything. The maintenance tunnel beneath cell block C had never been excavated. It had been sealed in concrete. And no one had looked inside in over 50 years. The concrete floor of the former Mecklenburg Correctional Center looked undisturbed from the outside, smooth, gray, anonymous. A warehouse now stood where cell block C had once loomed, its steel beams rising over what used to be one of Virginia's most volatile maximum security units. But beneath that polished slab was a maintenance tunnel no one had opened since 1972. Detective Marcus Hale stood with a court order in hand as construction crews wheeled in industrial drills. Dust floated in the late afternoon light, slicing through high windows. The air smelled of oil and old cement. "Once we break this," the site supervisor muttered, eyeing the blueprint, "there's no putting it back quietly." Hale didn't blink. That's the point. Back at Greensville Correctional Center, word had already spread. Even without smartphones, even without social media, prisons have their own communication network: glances, whispers, coded phrases passed between meal trays. Samuel Whitaker had refused his lunch. Leonard Bishop kept adjusting his hearing aid, though it wasn't malfunctioning. Calvin Morrow stared at the ceiling of the infirmary as if counting down seconds only he could hear. And Harold Finch, who hadn't spoken to anyone in months, finally broke his silence. "They won't find him," Finch murmured to the correctional officer distributing medication. The officer didn't respond, but he wrote it down. Back at the demolition site, the drill bit punched through the concrete with a shriek that echoed across the empty warehouse. Chunks cracked loose. Dust billowed into the air. It took 4 hours to carve an opening wide enough for a camera probe. Hale crouched as the technician fed a fiber optic line into the darkness. The monitor flickered, then stabilized. The tunnel was intact. Narrow. 6 feet high. Reinforced with aging support beams. Dust layered thick on the floor, undisturbed. Until the camera shifted left. There, half covered in collapsed insulation and debris, was something that didn't belong. A shape. Human. Hale felt his pulse spike. Zoom in. The camera edged closer. A skull partially embedded in dirt. Ribcage compressed beneath fallen timber. Remnants of fabric clinging to what had once been a shirt. 53 years. Victor Salas had never escaped. He had been buried inside the prison itself. Forensic teams sealed the site immediately. News helicopters circled by sunset. By morning, Virginia media outlets ran with a single headline: "Skeletal remains found beneath former prison. Cold case reopened." But for Hale, this wasn't just a cold case. It was a conspiracy that had survived 5 decades. Autopsy reports confirmed blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. No defensive fractures. No gunshot wounds. Salas hadn't died in a riot crossfire. He had been struck from behind. Execution style. Hale returned to Greensville with the medical examiner's findings. Whitaker looked older than he had just days before. "You found him," Whitaker said quietly. "Yes." Whitaker closed his eyes. "We were young," he murmured. "Stupid. Angry." "Angry about what?" Whitaker hesitated. "Salas wasn't like us. He kept records." "Records of what?" "Abuse. Guard brutality. Contraband. Names." The narrative shifted. The 1972 riot had officially been blamed on inmate unrest over overcrowding and food conditions. But internal investigations back then had been shallow. 2 guards dead meant the state focused on protecting its own. Salas, according to archived notes Hale uncovered, had filed multiple grievance complaints in the weeks before the riot. Most were dismissed. One report mentioned a specific officer repeatedly, Captain Douglas Kearns. Kearns had overseen Cell Block C the night of the riot. He had testified during the trial that chaos erupted without warning. But Kearns died in 1989. Conveniently, Hale pulled surviving personnel records. One correctional officer from that era was still alive, retired Sergeant Martin Duval, age 86, living in Norfolk. Duval answered the door himself. He moved slowly, but his eyes were sharp. When Hale mentioned Salas, the old man went pale. "I told them not to seal it," Duval whispered. "Seal what?" "The tunnel." Duval invited Hale inside. The living room walls were covered with framed commendations. A flag folded neatly in a display case. "They said it was easier," Duval continued. "Less paperwork. No escape investigation. No outside scrutiny." "Who said that?" "Kearns. And the warden." Duval's voice shook. Salas wasn't killed in the riot. He was pulled aside before it started. Hale leaned forward. By who? Duvall swallowed. Reddick. The name hit hard. Tommy Reddick? Duvall nodded. He thought Salas was going to expose a smuggling ring. What smuggling ring? Guards and inmates moving drugs, cigarettes, favors. Salas had names. Kearns panicked. And Reddick? Reddick was promised protection. Early parole. Extra privileges. Hale's mind raced. Did he kill Salas? Duvall looked down. He hit him. But he wasn't alone. Who else? Duvall's answer was barely audible. All of them. Back at Greensville, Hale placed 4 separate interview requests. Whitaker refused legal counsel. Bishop requested a priest. Morrow asked for water before speaking. Finch demanded silence. Hale started with Bishop. You told me to ask about the riot, Hale said. Bishop's eyes glistened. We thought we were protecting ourselves. From what? From the guards. From solitary. From being disappeared. Salas was documenting corruption. Bishop nodded slowly. And if that came out, they'd have shut the whole place down. Transfers. Lockdowns. We'd lose what little we had. So you killed him? Bishop's jaw trembled. We didn't mean to kill him. But blunt force trauma told a different story. Morrow's version was colder. He shouldn't have kept pushing, Morrow rasped. In prison, you survive by knowing when to stop. And Reddick? Morrow's gaze sharpened. Reddick hit first. The pieces aligned, but something still didn't sit right. If Reddick had struck Salas to protect a guard-run smuggling operation, why confess anything to the parole board 52 years later? Unless the deal had fallen apart. Hale requested the sealed testimony transcript from the Virginia Parole Board. It required state-level clearance. When it finally arrived, Hale read it alone. Reddick had confessed. Not just to participating, but to something bigger. He claimed Captain Kearns had ordered the hit on Salas before the riot began. That the riot itself was staged to cover up the killing. 2 guards had died during that chaos, but Reddick suggested their deaths were accidental, casualties of a fire intentionally set to create distraction. The official story of a spontaneous inmate uprising was false. It had been engineered, and Reddick had carried that secret for half a century. But the transcript didn't end there. In his final statement, Reddick named someone still alive. Harold Finch. According to Reddick, Finch had delivered the final blow. A second strike after Salas was already unconscious. One that fractured the skull completely. Which meant the murder wasn't just suppression. It was deliberate. Hale stared at Finch through the reinforced interview room glass. 90 years old. Frail. Hands resting calmly on the metal table. You're the only one who hasn't spoken, Hale said. Finch smiled faintly. You're chasing ghosts. No, Hale replied evenly. I'm chasing accountability. Finch leaned forward slightly. You think digging up bones changes anything? The guards are dead. The warden's dead. Most of us are dying. Tommy Reddick is dead too. That got Finch's attention. You said we buried him, Hale continued. But Reddick buried something else. Finch's eyes narrowed. What did he tell them? He told the parole board you struck the final blow. Silence filled the room. For several long seconds, Finch didn't blink. Then he spoke. He wanted to die clean. What does that mean? Finch's voice dropped to a whisper. He thought confessing would buy forgiveness. Forgiveness from who? Finch's lips curled slightly. Not the state. Hale felt a shift in the air. Did you have Reddick killed? Finch didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked a question of his own. Detective, did you ever wonder how a 92-year-old man, barely able to walk, ends up alone in a Richmond alley at midnight? Hale's chest tightened. Finch leaned back slowly. He wasn't wondering. The implication hit like a punch. You're saying someone called him out there? Finch's faint smile returned. Some debts, he said softly, outlive prison. And for the first time, Hale realized the murder of Victor Salas wasn't just resurfacing the past. It was igniting something in the present. Because if Finch had orchestrated Reddick's death from inside a maximum security facility, then G-Block wasn't just a retirement wing for aging criminals. It was still operational, and someone inside those walls was still pulling strings. The call records came in just before sunrise. Detective Marcus Hale sat alone in his office, the glow of his desk lamp cutting through the dim quiet of headquarters. On the screen in front of him was a list of outgoing calls made from Greensville Correctional Center's monitored inmate phone system during the week leading up to Tommy Reddick's murder. One number appeared 3 times. A prepaid cell phone registered under a false name. Activated 6 days before Reddick was killed. Deactivated the morning after. Hale leaned back slowly. "Follow the money," he muttered. Because even in prison, nothing moves without payment. Financial investigators traced commissary deposits linked to Harold Finch's inmate account. Small amounts at first. Then, 2 months before Reddick's parole, a deposit of $4,000, far beyond what family members typically sent. The sender? A Shell LLC registered in North Carolina. Digging deeper, Hale found the LLC had been dissolved just weeks after Reddick's release. A coincidence, maybe. But the prepaid phone had pinged cell towers near the company's registered address. The pieces were aligning. Hale drove back to Greensville without notifying the warden in advance. Harold Finch was sitting in the common area, sunlight casting long stripes across the polished floor. He looked peaceful, almost fragile. But Hale had stopped underestimating him. "You funded it," Hale said calmly, placing printed bank records on the table between them. "The phone. The contact." Finch didn't look surprised. "At my age," Finch replied softly, "money doesn't have much use. Except leverage." Finch's thin lips curved faintly. "You think I hired someone? From in here? I think you knew exactly who to call." Finch adjusted the blanket draped across his lap. "Tommy broke the code," he said. "We survived by silence. He chose confession. He chose accountability." Finch's eyes sharpened. "He chose betrayal." The word hung heavy between them. Hale leaned forward. "You were all promised protection in 1972. Lighter sentences. Privileges. That deal dissolved over time. You served decades anyway." Finch nodded slightly. "Deals change. Survival doesn't. So you punished him?" "No," Finch replied. "I reminded him." Hale's jaw tightened. Reminded him of what? That actions have consequences. The prepaid phone had been used to contact a single number repeatedly before Reddick's death. That number belonged to a 38-year-old man named Eric Salas. Victor Salas's grandson. Eric had grown up hearing fragments of a story. A grandfather who vanished during a prison riot. An official explanation that never felt complete. When Hale knocked on Eric's apartment door in Richmond, the man answered cautiously. "I didn't kill anyone," Eric said immediately, before Hale even introduced himself. "I'm not here to accuse you," Hale replied evenly. "I'm here to understand." Eric ran a hand through his hair. "He called me." "Who?" "A man who said he knew what happened to my grandfather." "Did he give a name?" Eric hesitated. "He said to call him H." Hale's stomach dropped. "What did H tell you?" "That my grandfather didn't die in a riot. That he was murdered. That one of the men responsible was about to walk free. Reddick. He said justice had been delayed long enough." "And you met Reddick?" Eric looked away. "Yes." "Where?" "In that alley." Hale's voice stayed steady. "What happened?" Eric swallowed hard. "I wanted answers. I wanted him to admit it. He kept saying he was sorry. That he tried to stop it. That he didn't mean for it to happen. But he also said they all agreed to keep quiet." Silence filled the apartment. "Did you push him?" Hale asked carefully. Eric's breathing quickened. He stumbled. "That's not what the autopsy suggests." Eric's voice cracked. "I didn't mean to." "You struck him?" Eric covered his face with his hands. "He laughed," he whispered. "He said prison already took his life. That there was nothing left to punish. And that made you angry." Eric nodded. Hale didn't interrupt. "He fell," Eric continued. Hit his head. I panicked. I left. The medical report confirmed blunt force trauma. But there were no signs of prolonged assault. No multiple strikes. It aligned disturbingly well with a single blow. Hale's mind replayed Finch's words. Some deaths outlive prison. Finch hadn't hired a hitman. He had weaponized grief. He found a grandson. He fed him truth, carefully curated. Enough to ignite confrontation. Enough to ensure someone else carried out revenge. All from inside a maximum security facility. Hit subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and stay until the end.